this afternoon in Europe, at least, yeah, 5 talks. Each talk will take 10 minutes plus 5 minutes questions. If you feel taking more than 10 minutes, at any rate, don't take more than 12 or 13, so that there is at least time for 1 or 2 questions. First talk, I'll begin the first talk, which is about decentralized anonymization of mobility data. So the idea is to see what are the options to release mobility data for secondary use. The normal paradigm is centralized, but it is probably fairer and more ethical to empower people with anonymizing their own data. Then there will be a second talk by Frederick Richter from the Foundation for Data Protection in Germany. That will be about data sovereignty in the connected vehicle. Who owns the data related to vehicles, to connected vehicles. Then there will be another talk by Thierry Chevalier from AK Technologies in France. He's the coordinator of the H2020 Mobile Data Lab project, which is about publishing and exploiting mobility data in the transport sector. He will be telling us about the project. Then there will be another talk by René Peralta. René works at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. And he will be talking about studying population dynamics without compromising people's privacy, which is a difficult thing to do, but there are ways. And finally, Giovanni Comandè from the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Italy, in Pisa, will be talking about mobility data reidentification opportunities and risks. And that is the content of this afternoon's panel. My name is, I forgot to say, is Josep Domingo-Ferrer. I am a professor of computer science at Universitat Rovira Virgili in Tarragona, Catalonia. I am a member of the SoBigData H2020 project that sponsors this awareness panel. And yes, I'll be happy to present the first talk if you are ready to listen. So let me stop sharing this and start sharing my presentation. Okay. Yeah, now make it bigger. Hopefully you can see it now well. And no. Okay, so I think it's best thing is for me to share the desktop.
You need to share the screen.
Yeah. This is what I'm doing. Okay, so hopefully that works now. Yeah, this is about decentralized anonymization of mobility data. As I said, my name is Josep Domingo-Ferrer. I'm professor at Universitat Rovira Virgili in Tarragona, Catalonia. I also lead the CyberCat, which is the Center for Cybersecurity Research of Catalonia. And I also lead the UNESCO chair in data privacy. Yeah, mobility data are very useful. And monitoring mobility data, in fact, is used to improve public health, transportation, urban planning, economic planning, etc. These days, we have seen that it is very useful to control COVID. This has been an area in which a lot of people have discovered that mobility data exist and they are useful. In fact, East Asian countries, most notably Korea, China, and Japan, have made extensive use of mobility data to monitor the spread of the disease of COVID, for example. Here you have a map with the locations of, well, of positive people in a Korean city. And so that has been really effective, although also very intrusive. In the first moment of the spread of the pandemics, considerations about privacy were left aside in those countries, and they went for maximum efficiency. And this really worked quite well, at least initially. However, we have a problem, and the problem is that trajectories are personally identifiable information. And in Europe, at least, we have legal reasons, namely the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and also cultural reasons, like it's no one else's business where I choose to go, to require that trajectories be anonymized before releasing them for secondary use. Indeed, the origin of a trajectory and the destination may uniquely characterize the subject following that trajectory, and sometimes even some intermediate locations are also very characteristic. So one should take care. Trajectory anonymization is necessary if one wants to release or share trajectories for secondary uses, for secondary analysis. Trajectories are really known by contractual reasons, for example, for contractual reasons by telecom operators, and they cannot help knowing them because they must give us a service, for example. But the different issue is whether those telecom operators can release or share the knowledge they have on the movements of people for secondary analysis, even if that secondary analysis is very laudable, like fighting a disease. I mean, to share those data with other actors, those data should be anonymized. Anonymization cannot be limited to suppressing the metadata containing the subject's identity. You cannot just suppress the name of the person and leave the trajectory without any alteration. As I said before, the origin, the destination, and even certain intermediate points may allow re-identifying the subject who followed the trajectory. Therefore, you must do more changes to the trajectory before releasing it for secondary use. In fact, proper anonymization requires masking the spatial temporal information. You need to change locations to distort them to some extent. You need to change the time labels, etc. You cannot leave things as they are. The usual way to perform anonymization in any sorts of data, be they standard structured data or trajectories for that matter, is a centralized approach. So the setting is that the subjects send the original movement data to some controller, or in some cases the controller does not even need the subjects to send their data. If the controller is, say, a telecom operator, the controller directly gathers movement data for service reasons, for contractual reasons. And so the subjects don't need to do anything. Their movements get tracked by default by, in this case, the telecom operator. And in any case, the controller gathers all the data and produces an anonymized mobility data set. And then once this data set has been obtained, it can be released or shared for secondary use to health authorities, administrations, or researchers, etc. So let's give an example of how trajectories could be anonymized in a centralized way. Here we have a very well-known privacy model, k-anonymity, which consists of clustering subjects into groups of at least k, and then releasing a representative of each cluster of k subjects, which could be the centroid of that cluster. So this also works for trajectories. Given a data set of trajectories, those trajectories can be what is called micro-aggregated into clusters of at least k trajectories each. The difference between micro-aggregation and standard clustering is that in micro-aggregation, the constraint is on the minimum size of the cluster. It should have at least k elements, in this case, k trajectories. It doesn't matter how many clusters there are, but each cluster should have at least k trajectories. And then if you disseminate the centroid trajectory of each cluster for secondary use, you are you are sticking to the k-anonymity privacy model. No trajectory can be distinguished within the cluster of k trajectories to which it belongs. Here you would have an example of how to compute the centroid of two trajectories. This would be the centroid trajectory in dashed line, and the boldface lines are the original two trajectories, and the dashed line is the centroid trajectory of those two trajectories. And this operation can be performed for any cluster of k or more trajectories. If you have a good micro-aggregation heuristic, then you will obtain clusters that are maximally similar, or at least very similar, where the trajectories in those clusters are very similar, so that when you replace the original trajectories in a cluster by their centroid, the loss of information will be small. This is very clear. So if you have very diverse elements or trajectories in a cluster, and you pretend and you try to change those elements by the centroid, then the loss of information will be very high. Whereas if you have very similar trajectories in the cluster, they will be well represented by their centroid, which will not be very different from any of those trajectories. So here the key point is for this controller to find clusters of pretty similar trajectories. So this works well. It entails some manipulation in the locations and in the time labels, but it can be done. However, we should say that decentralized anonymization is ethically preferable. In fact, what you can do in a decentralized way, you should not do in a centralized way. The idea is that we should try to empower subjects so that they don't need to reveal their original movement data to whoever it is. If they can anonymize their trajectories locally and still adhere to a privacy model, then this is much better than following the previous centralized approach. Let's give an example of how, for example, k-anonymity could work in a decentralized manner. This is the thing. You could have decentralized k-anonymous trajectories using also micro-aggregation. And the idea is that a subject, let's say PI, publishes a generalized version of her trajectory with the aim of finding k-1 other similar trajectories from other subjects. Here in this graph, you have this generalized trajectory. So the bold-faced line is the real trajectory of the subject PI. But the subject, instead of publishing the points of the trajectory, publishes only the squares in this grid. So the generalized trajectory would consist of this square, this square, this square here, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So instead of publishing points, you publish areas, you publish squares. And in that way, you only vaguely reveal the places you have been visiting, provided that this grid is large enough. And then, based on this generalized trajectory consisting of squares, subjects with similar trajectories can realize that they followed this, that they visited the same squares. And if there are k-1 subjects that follow the same squares, they can anonymously send their trajectories, or even parts of them, maybe not the full trajectories, but only a few points, a few locations, to PI. And this can be done using an anonymous channel or a multi-hop mechanism, whereby the peers don't directly send their trajectory information to PI, but do it using other intermediate peers. There are several ways in which this communication can be made anonymous. And that's the idea. Once the PI gathers K-1 trajectories, other partial trajectories that crossed the same squares as her own, then she can compute the centroid trajectory of those K trajectories, hers and the other K-1, and release that centroid as the anonymized version of the cluster of K trajectories. So this is feasible and can be done. So in conclusion, we acknowledge that the easiest and most efficient solution is, of course, to leverage mobility data without any regard for people's privacy, as it was recently done in East Asian countries to fight COVID. But trajectories are sensitive personal data. And if you really can, you should try to anonymize them. It is not only possible to anonymize trajectories, but this can be done in a decentralized and efficient way so that the subjects retain control on their original trajectory data. People's whereabouts should be disclosed as little as possible. And that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Actually, Josep,
yeah,
if I may, it's very interesting. We discussed it in the past. I was just wondering whether in the decentralized way, it would be possible to think in terms not naturally of anonymization of data, the trajectories, but think in terms of synthetic data, so locally generated synthetic data to perturbate before aggregating. Because I mean, synthetic data are widely used these days. So I'm guessing I'm not, I'm a jurist, not a technological expert, but this is repeatedly popping up in my mind. If we can leverage the synergy between locally produced synthetic data, which are similar, so that makes more difficult reidentification. Second question is, basically, you didn't say it expressly, but the key point is eventual attacks for identification. Mm-hmm. And now, again, we go back to this idea of the synthetic data. The attacks, any kind of attack, is made more difficult if we have a larger data set to re-identify. So what would be your reactions on that?
I mean, the thing, synthetic data are very popular in many applications, not only trajectories, in any kind of data that you want to release. The thing is that to produce synthetic data, you should have a global view of what the original data are. So, and then, for example, imagine you have a big data set that is original, and you want to preserve some features of those original data, like some statistics, correlations, etc. And then you produce simulated synthetic data that preserves some of the statistical features of the original data. And only those features will be present in the synthetic data. I mean, the data users for those data will find nothing that you didn't put into the synthetic data in the first place. And to create those synthetic data, you need to have a view of what the overall synthetic original data are. That's why producing synthetic data in a decentralized manner is, I would say, quite difficult, if not impossible, because you are on your own. You only see your own record. So you have no idea what the statistics to be preserved about the original data are, because you only see your own record. You need to see the records of many people in order to see what the statistics are, in order to see what you want to preserve when creating synthetic data. If you only see your own record, I mean, the only way to create a synthetic version of your record is to generate random values without any any utility preservation. And of course, if everyone generates random values, it's unlikely that the overall data will be useful. There are ways, of course, to generate, let's say, randomized response, local differential privacy, and this kind of stuff, whereby you can modify your original data into something that is different, but it is not fully synthetic. It is based on your original data. Okay.
Thank you.
Francesca as well.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Josep, for the very interesting presentation. I agree that we, as a researcher, should focus on a decentralized framework also for anonymity. So I really agree with you. However, I have a couple of very basic questions. So the first one is about the grid that you used for generalized trajectory. I imagine that there is the need to share among peers this grid in order to have the same representation of data. This is correct?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then another question, which is a silly question too. I didn't read the paper yet, but I wonder what are the guarantees that you can really reach anonymity. So you say that the square must be sufficient big in order to preserve anonymity. So I wonder if you provide also some guarantees that you can reach or you can go pretty close to reach a key value.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a good question indeed, because when you publish a grid, I mean, you hope that the grid will be large enough so that you will find k-1 other trajectories that also visited the squares in that grid. If you publish too small squares that are too small, you will not find those k-1 other people, and then you will fail to have k-anonymity, and you will have to enlarge your squares so that in the next version of your grid, you will already find the k-1 people that ensure k-anonymity for you. But in the meantime, you have published a version of your trajectory that was not exactly k-anonymous. So the first version of your grid that you publish should be vague enough so that you feel comfortable with it. The other way would be to proceed backwards. You publish a terribly bad grid, very large one, which says nothing. And then if you find more than k-1 people, then you can reduce the grid and go backwards until you only find k-1 people. But there is a sort of bet. The initial peer that publishes a generalized trajectory has to bet that this will be enough in terms of privacy, or that this will be enough in terms of utility. There is always this trade-off. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think that it's time to move on. I will be happy to take questions by email if anyone wants to send them, but otherwise we'll accumulate a lot of delay. So let's briefly go back to the schedule for today. And second talk, as I said, is Data Sovereignty Integrated Vehicle by Frederick Richter, Foundation for Data Protection. Frederick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josep. Thank you for invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And I would like to take the liberty to take you from the level of concrete technical solutions to a more general level, to a more basic level, and think about the definition of data sovereignty and talk about some points from data protection law. This is a kind of sidekick to the technical solutions, but I think it is helpful too. Mm-hmm. So everything we do about data protection and privacy in cars and vehicles is meant to protect the human being using the technical item. We want to protect the subject against the objects, or better, protect the individual, the data subject, against risks arising from the deployment of technique in the car. We want to achieve and assure data sovereignty, as we say. But what is this, I'd like to ask you? What does it mean exactly? Well, you see, I'm from Germany. And in Germany, some of you might have experienced, quite many people are convinced that we do not only invent data protection law in 1970, but that we also have the clearest notion how to protect natural persons and also what to protect. In 1983, our federal German Constitutional Court created a new basic right that has not been in our constitution before that judgment. The court took the right to human dignity and the right to personal freedom, and it synthesized the right to informational self-determination, as it is called. Everyone should have control regarding the use and processing of information that refers to her or him. And since information is contained and transported in data, we see that the idea of informational self-determination is very close to the idea of data sovereignty. Perhaps it's even synonymous. So that would mean we would already know what data sovereignty means. It would then aim at the core of data protection law. The problem is this construction only applies to former German law. The concept of informational self-determination, when we understand this as data sovereignty, this concept never made it across the German border. It did not spread around the world. It even failed to make it to Brussels. It's not in the GDPR. When you look into the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, you will see the rights to privacy in Article 7 and the right to data protection, Article 8. And you won't find an answer as well about what is protected by data protection. Is it that data sovereignty? Is it informational self-determination? Well, it gets clearer, at least to some extent, when you eventually look into the GDPR itself, which is, of course, beneath the Charter. There in the GDPR, it is laid down that data protection law protects fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons. And you might say, well, that means it protects nearly everything. And you might ask, and you might doubt that data protection law is able to succeed in this huge task. But nevertheless, data sovereignty as a claim gives us an idea of what to strive for. We want to give people more transparency and more control regarding the processing of data referring to them. And as we talk about mobility today in this round, it may sound a bit corny to you, but in this context, I simply love to say, we want to put the driving person into the driver's seat. Because in the driver's seat, you are in control. You've been in control since the invention of the car more than a century ago. Of course, you had to rely on the technical devices and instruments. You simply had to expect that the brakes would break if you give the order by putting down your foot. But you always had the ability to give the order. You were in control. And it was quite transparent. You knew basically what was happening in the car. When we talk about the connected car, the situation gets much more complex. With the digitization and datafication of many parts and equipment of the vehicle, the sovereignty of the person in charge of driving decreases. So what do we have to offer to persons who want to uphold their data sovereignty when using a car or other vessel that is no lonesome machine anymore, but a computer on wheels, always online, always trackable and traceable by its maker, its vendor, or the leasing company, or the insurance company, and others. So what do we have to offer? The EU Data Protection Regulation offers many rules and restrictions that were designed to maintain a special level of data privacy. But this law was written with the attitude to be strictly neutral when it comes to regulate the usage of certain technologies. This is why you won't find terms like blockchain or artificial intelligence in the GDPR or big data. You always won't find descriptions of methods like big data or of situations and contexts like mobility. There's nothing in it. The GDPR is meant to be a kind of universal tool to regulate any thinkable processing of personal data. This makes it easy and difficult at the same time, in my view, when it comes to implement the law properly. In the mobility sector, we have the situation that getting from one point to another is the main aim of persons using vehicles. The usage of their data is of always, or most of the times, of minor interest for most drivers. That causes difficulties for providers when they want to provide compliance, GDPR compliance, that is user-centric and user-friendly. They are, the car providers, the car makers are confronted with a data subject who wants to drive and not to read. Okay, and in cars of the future, moving autonomously, you might be wanting to read or to watch something, but in today's cars, in which you will still have to put your concentration on driving, you're not willing to read privacy policies and some long requests asking for consent in this data processing or that data processing. You want to drive, you want to start, you don't want to click on any I agree. So when we want to provide more transparency and control to persons using connected cars, we should not stick to traditional instruments. Of course, we will always need conventional users' rights, such as the right to deletion. For example, if you sell a connected car and want to have deleted your data, the data you generated indirectly with your tools in the vehicle. But we have to ask what innovative instruments may expand the extent of data sovereignty that data protection law offers to date. I would like to suggest three things: the deployment of privacy dashboards, the deployment of privacy icons, and of privacy information management services, the so-called PIMs. Those icons I mentioned are already prescribed in the GDPR in its Article 12, paragraph 7. This is an instrument truly to be welcomed, but it is not filled with life yet, even 5 years after the adoption of the GDPR. There are no official proposals yet, neither by the European Commission, who is in charge, nor by any member state or by the European Data Protection Board. And this is really a pity, because standardized icons and symbols that, as the text of the GDPR puts it, could give a meaningful overview of the intended data processing in an easily visible, intelligible, and clearly legible manner. So proposals are welcome because such icons used on the screens of cars could provide much better and easier transparency to the drivers than long texts can. As icons, which only inform, can only provide information and not control, we also need stronger tools. A privacy dashboard can offer both transparency and control. A privacy dashboard can inform the person in the car on the central screen about relevant data processing procedures. But it should not stop there. It should also enable the driving person to deactivate data usage, perhaps in certain situations, perhaps for certain tools, and offer a real choice between less or more intrusive functions. And with those PIMs, those personal information management systems or services, we step into a whole new era of user-centric data ecosystem. Because that is the idea. Not like today, where the data processor rather takes the data from the consumer just faces a choice like take it or leave it, buy the car and all that is inside of data processing, or just don't buy the car. With this PIMS approach, users shall come to a stance where they are not only affected persons, as the data protection law calls them, anymore, but real data subjects who offer data under conditions set by them as preference to the PIMS system and given to data processors in a sovereign matter. Of course, that constellation sounds idealistic, of course, but the idea of a user-centric data economy is worth to be followed, not only in the mobility sector. There is no official definition of PIMS yet. The German lawmakers took a first step in the last week when they adopted a law concerning the e-privacy directive. And there it is laid down that the PIMS provider should have no economic interest in the user data that the PIMS manages. But of course, there are many varieties of definitions of PIMS thinkable. It could be some kind of consent management tool. It also could provide consent to data processing itself. There are other points like data trusts that could be of high importance. We have in Germany a project that is called the Neutral Server Project, which is an initiative of Daimler and BMW, which should act as a kind of data hub, a kind of data trust, where anonymized data of connected cars is put in to provide more security on the streets. The importance of anonymization was mentioned by Josep already. I think anonymization is a very crucial point, and there is work to do. The GDPR does not give guidance to any provider how to anonymize data properly. It only says the GDPR is not comprises the use of anonymous data, but there are no guidelines of how to anonymize data. This is a big task to do. The discussion of data ownership, I think this is kind of over. The German Ministry of Infrastructure and Traffic some years ago demanded that the owner of a car should own the data that is produced when the car is used. But this idea is not discussed anymore, so the discussion on data ownership is kind of over because it's incompatible to the GDPR and is not followed by the EU in the Data Governance Act or the Data Act. So I think this is not a point anymore, but anonymization and PIMS are really, really big tasks in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. We are a bit late in schedule, but I think there is time for one.
Sorry.
No, it was also my fault. If there is one short question, we can take it. In fact, I think that you were over pessimistic when you said that this informational self-determination is not being adopted outside Germany. When we are asked what privacy in the online world means, there is no other better definition. I think. And when we move to decentralized anonymization, it is that. I mean, it's following that tendency, which is allowing people to self-determine what they reveal. In fact, I think that this idea pervades the technology that is being created these days. So yeah, it's an important notion. If there is no other question, then let's go to the next talk. Next talk is by Thierry Chevalier, AK Technologies France. Thierry will present the SoBigData Lab project, H2020 project. Thierry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josep. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you can see my screen now.
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So, well, my name is Thierry Chevalier. I work indeed for AK Technologies, and I'm the coordinator of the SoBigData Lab project, which is funded by the European Commission under the H2020 research program. Just a word about the context of this project. Actually, there was a call for proposal by the European Commission last year about improving data sharing in the transport sector. So I will not go through the whole list of objectives of this call for proposal, but anyway, what is interesting is to see that the European Commission wanted to have a comparative analysis of the transportation regulation across the different transport modes. Also wanted to identify possible frameworks for data sharing across the transport system. And also wanted to have a project who will propose standardization, and it's because it's not only a matter of technology, also analyze the relationships between private and public stakeholders on this ecosystem, because there are a lot of different stakeholders, and the role of data sharing culture, and insist on the word culture, is also very important. The project started last February. We are in the early stages of the project. So the project is meant to last for the next 3 years. And if we should summarize it, it's make it easy for mobility stakeholders to share their data. So it's a huge program indeed. But well, if we try to summarize it a bit, according to a value proposition, let's say, approach, what is the problem which is faced today by these mobility stakeholders? We know that first there are new mobility services which appear daily, almost daily, whether they are physical services or digital. And these services lead to the production of more and more data in various forms. And everyone agrees that data sharing would be important to lead to more efficient processes and new products. But well, there is a lot of reluctance to share data yet. And for different reasons that we identified, this is not exhaustive, but at least we have concerns about data privacy. There is concerns about complying with the regulations, which are still evolving and sometimes difficult to follow. There is the risk of losing competitive advantage. This is mainly for public actors, private actors, sorry. And on the other hand, fear of losing control of data, also for public actors. On the technology side, there is the lack of cloud solutions and interoperability issues. Well, we propose the following solution, which is mainly based on 4 moments, let's say, or 4 stages. The first one is to build an open knowledge base, because sharing data starts with sharing knowledge between the different stakeholders, whether they are public or private, because sometimes the level is at the local level, whether it is city or regions, and most of the public transport authorities want to know about what has been done in other cities or regions, and the same for companies, actually. The second stage is the proof of value, which is the building of a transport cloud, a demonstrator of a portal of open mobility data. The third one, and I think it's maybe the most important in the project, is to put into practice, and in order to improve the data sharing culture, bringing together data providers on the one hand and data users on the other in innovation sessions, which we call living and virtual labs. And finally, assess the impact of all that we will be doing. So there is a team of fundee, which we call the consortium. There is a Catalonia ourselves, but also several organizations. There is iThon in Greece, which is a consulting company specialized in transport. There is the National Council of Research in Italy, that you all well know. F6S in Ireland is a network of startups and SME. F6S stands for founders, actually. There is a well-known mapping company, Here Technologies, ICOR, which is an inter-university consortium in Italy. Kizio Digital is the digital branch of a public transport operator in France. The University of Leuven are legal experts. Police is a network of cities and public transport authorities. And finally, last but not least, the University of Rovira and Virgili, which are data privacy experts. And what is important is that beside this consortium, we have an advisory board, which are very skilled in mobility data. So the first one is the UITP, which is the International Union for Public Transport. Mobility data is an association which is behind the well-known GTFS standard, Google Transit Feed Specification, for sharing, let's say, schedule line information. There is the MAS Alliance. Mobility as a service is really a very important word in the world of mobility data. We will just explore it a bit later. Ertico for automated cars and connected cars, La Fabrique des Mobilités, and the Data Protection Authority in Catalonia, and last but not least, the Open Data Institute. And altogether, we are currently working in the state of the art, so with different approaches. The first one regarding legal and governance, which is a comparison of the different regulations which are around regarding transport data sharing. We are also exploring data privacy with our partner URV and Josep in particular, about privacy by design strategies, privacy risk assessment tools, privacy preserving technologies. There is also standards, because it's the world of mobility data is highly standardized, with public transport standards, road traffic standards, and new mobility, which are emerging, whether they are e-scooters or bike sharing, etc. Also, we are studying cloud solutions, analyzing and evaluating them, and finally the use cases, which we'll discuss a bit later in this presentation. Regarding the proof of value, our idea was to provide a prototype platform for searching and fusing mobility, multimodal mobility data, not starting from scratch, but reusing open source tools as possible. And the main point is what we call the cloud federation, which is meant to provide seamless access to resources in the cloud for data sharing. Also a reference data catalog for exploring data available in a given municipality or region, data access services, data privacy, whose aim is to provide anonymization, reduce the risk of reidentification, and provide utility metrics about the loss of information. And also we will have processors, because actually mobility data gain value when combined with data coming from other fields and other sectors, for instance, through geographic enrichment or what we call semantic enrichment. What is important is that we are not only working on our side, but rather we will involve a lot of stakeholders. And this is done through what we call living labs and virtual labs, whether they are hackathons, datathons, or Codagon. So we rely on two of our partners. The first one is Polis, which is a network of cities and regions and public transport authorities, and who will provide concrete mobility challenges they face daily in their local area. On the other side, there is the F6S network of SMEs and startups who will participate and take up the challenges. Regarding the reference group of mobility stakeholders, we have several cities and regions. There is, for instance, the city of Rome, the mobility agency of Milan, Eindhoven, there is the Hochbahn in Hamburg, and we have also regions like the Baden-Württemberg land in Germany, and also the New York State department, transportation department. Also, we are assessing the impact. So in dark blue here is shown what we are currently doing, evaluating actors' needs and providing a market analysis that will be made public. So it would be interesting also for every one of you to have a look at the SoBigData Lab website to explore this analysis once they will be published. As the work is ongoing, there are still some interesting information to gain from, well, some other organizations we relate to, being part of the advisory board. For instance, there is the WBCSD organization, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They published a very interesting report that I suggest you to have a look at regarding the emerging principles for sharing mobility data in the urban context. And there are ethical issues are well, just underlined. So for these emerging principles, for instance, there is the principle number 2, which states that data sharing must be ethical, inclusive, and unbiased. And the and the principle number 3, which state that data sharing should incorporate privacy by design. So we know that the collection and sharing of mobility data is prone to the risk of misuse, and transparent data sharing models are needed. Privacy by design principle need to be integrated, and we will concentrate on this in the MobiData Lab project. And also anonymization mechanisms are needed, we know it well, but aggregating multiple types of data from different sources raise the risk of identifying an individual. Another interesting organization who provided a report about mobility data is the UITP, which is part of the advisory board, and published last November a report on sharing of data in the public transport in particular. And then it's interesting because when we are discussing about mobility data, we can ask ourselves the question, but what is mobility data actually? So here we have a lot of examples of 3 categories of data. So there are, for public transport in particular, there are customer data. And as you can see, there are a lot of red here. This is a high risk type of data regarding anonymization and ethical issues, and at least reluctance for sharing data from the corresponding organizations. On the other hand, there is static mobility data, which we can see everything in green. Data sharing is efficient. I mean, it's widespread, let's say, about stop and station information, line routes description, timetable information, and so on. And there is dynamic mobility data, a bit less shared right now, in particular regarding the new mobility and private actors in this sector, which are reluctant. And we can guess that it is mainly with the fear of losing competitive advantages. But if we concentrate on the customer data, we can see that this is there is a risk which is felt by the different organizations regarding anonymization, regarding the sharing of anonymized personal data, CRM data, and payment and ticketing data. In the context of the project, we will just explore this application of these privacy measures in different use cases, and we think on 2 use cases in particular from now. Some other use cases may emerge coming from our stakeholders, but anyway, the first one is the reuse of transport data for journey planners. Our partner Kizio is himself developing and providing a journey planner, which is called Navicia, and one of their main concern is data privacy, main concern for sharing data at least. And also what we call the mobility as a service, which is the fact for an application to be able to provide information on multimodal access from point A to point B, booking functionalities, and also payment and ticketing. Also, other areas where we feel that we could apply these privacy measures is smart city applications and also accessibility. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you, Thierry. So one short question can be accommodated.
Josep, may I suggest that we move the questions at the end so that I have plenty of questions for Thierry and Frederick, but I don't want to stop the ongoing and prevent René. I will cut short my presentation, but I want to listen also to René.
Okay, that's fine. Then let's move to René's presentation. René is from NIST, and his presentation is studying population dynamics without compromising people's privacy. René, floor is yours.
Okay, let me see if I can share the screen here.
There is this icon on at the bottom of the screen, share screen, and then
yeah.
share the full desktop. It's probably the best.
So I'm on a government computer here, and it's try again.
Now, yes, it works.
Okay, yeah. So Zoom was in the list of bad actors for the U.S. government for a long time. So this is not a common platform for us. Okay, so I'm at NIST. NIST is a standards and measurement arm of the U.S. government. Okay, I work in the cryptographic technology group, and one of the projects I'm involved with is this privacy enhancing cryptography group, and here is the a link for that if you want to see what else we do. So at NIST, we would like to be able to measure the levels of interactions in a population of autonomous agents. Okay, autonomous agents be cars, sheep, people, soccer players, what have you. In human populations, the higher levels of interaction means faster spread of infectious diseases. That's one of the working assumptions. Besides enabling automatic exposure notification, this is where people are notified that they've had risky encounters or encounters with people who've been sick. We want to engineer environments so as to slow the spread of disease. So we want to give us more time to react when the next pandemics hits. So if our working environments are such that somehow we've altered them so as to lower the level of interactions, say by moving offices, common areas to particular building locations, opening, modifying the exits and so on, then that might help us if that's done, at a sufficiently high scale. And so this is a long-term goal. Unfortunately, it's quite common that once the pandemic is over, we're gonna forget to prepare for the next pandemic. But I'm trying to make that not be the case. So understanding population dynamics would be useful in many other contexts. And we want to develop this capability, measuring how these autonomous agents are interacting with each other in such a way that we don't normalize surveillance of human populations. So here's how we've parameterize the problem. When two people coincide in space and time window, we call this an encounter. So we want to detect these, we want to label them, the encounters. We want to evaluate the length or severity. We want to aggregate and derive encounter metric statistics. Among the applications are exposure notification, engineering our working environments, and many others. This is a design decision that we want to make very early on, if we're going to develop these capabilities, is that we do not label the parties involved. So it's not Alice and Bob. The encounter is not the pair Alice, Bob. It is just a name that cannot be traced to identities. This is actually not hard to do. Cryptographers have known how to do this since roughly after World War II or so. Two devices can create a common secret, a common random number, in such a way that that number is never exposed to outside of the devices. Furthermore, if the number is later, say, posted on a bulletin board, say, then only the owners of that secret can link the secret to themselves. For cryptographers in the audience, this would be, Diffie-Hellman key exchange or any of a number of possible ways to implement this. So what problem are we trying to mitigate is well, in modern life, we're constantly exposing our identity to machines. When we go in front of security cameras all the time, and there's traffic cameras, they're reading our license plates. When we enter our buildings, many of us have to swipe our credentials. When we go to the supermarket, we use our credit card, or when we go to the ATM. In all those situations, some machine knows our identity. If at the same time we're broadcasting pseudonyms, which is the case that which is the standard way that the Google, Apple devices operate, then whoever is sniffing these pseudonyms will cease to be pseudonyms. They'll be basically linked to our identities, and that's a problem. And in particular, it's a problem that is so easy to avoid, right? It should have been done. It wasn't done, and that is not a place we wanted to be at. So, in the context of exposure notification, then if you want if you don't want, say, employers to be able to find out who was exposed to possibly infected people, then you have a problem if you're using the Google, Apple mechanism. There was, when all this about exposure notification came up, the whole world started working on these apps, and a large number of academics got together and enumerated some principles that should be respected by all such apps. By the way, there's over 500 vendors of these apps now, so it's significant. And I suspect these will live way past the pandemic, so they'll be there in our phones, doing stuff that who knows what they're doing. So among these principles, I copied a few here. The system must be used for public health. The system must not be capable of collecting, processing, transmitting any more data than what is necessary to achieve this purpose. Solutions must be fully transparent. The protocols and their implementations, including components provided by companies, must be available for public analysis. It's hard to disagree with any of this. It's just basic stuff that we should demand, right? Well, but then it is problematic if the app is subordinate to commercial processes and constraints. So if somebody tells you that you can only broadcast pseudonyms every 3 times a minute, and we have the right to ask why. Then it's also problematic if the system is installed on top of a surveillance platform, such as current smartphones. Current smartphones are basically a surveillance platform for commercial interests, which are not necessarily our own interests. Furthermore, if we're not given low-level access to the platform where these applications live, then that is, that's not fully transparent. In summary, the big picture is we should be better prepared for the next pandemic. And this should not be used as an excuse to normalize surveillance of human populations. I will leave you with a quote from one of my, somebody who thinks very deeply about these things, much more than I can. This is my friend, Sita Gerses. She says, what these companies did threatens to squeeze out any concept of agency out of users and developers alike. This potentially limits the agency of scientists and public health authorities. And this is a very significant problem in my view. There are many details to this encounter metrics idea that we're trying to push, and there's a paper, and here's the link. So I was very fast. Thank you.
Thank you, René. That was a very good reflection. We tended to think that the solutions by Google and Apple were super perfect, and you really showed that they aren't. Yeah. So let's go to the final talk, and then hopefully we can still find some time for questions. Last talk is by Giovanni Comandè, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, Pisa, and it is entitled Mobility Data Reidentification Opportunities and Risks. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Josep. Thanks to all the panelists. When we, with Josep, started to organize this awareness panel, we were sure that it would have been a very challenging and thought-provoking one, and as it is. And not only to the time constraints that we have, but due to all the presentations are basically forcing me to trash my own presentation, and try to summarize some awfully thought-provoking reactions from the various intervention. I'm just displaying a commercial. As you see, we have 4 positions in a parallel to SoBigData, which we work in Horizon 2020. We have 4 doctoral positions, so contact me if there is any interest in the interplay between data science and law. But going directly to what I would like to now say to you. First of all, we moved from different angles to mobility data. I mean, from the Josep and Thierry description of what is going on, I think it emerged already that there is not only a technological, and economic need to harness the richness of mobility data, but I think there is also, I would say, an ethical imperative to not throw away the baby of mobility data with the dirty water that clearly is surrounding the use and exploitation of mobility data. And I think Frederick made all this very, very, very clear, linking to the tools we have and the tools we miss in the GDPR and in the surrounding legislation. Now, this leads me basically, and then I will move forward to the claim that René Peralta just did. Guys, are we perhaps forgetting that there is also a public good, public interest, general interest, if you want, in data mining, also in mobility, and especially I would say in mobility data that needs to be harnessed for good. And that's, I think, the first big takeaway that I would like to stress here. I mean, we have been focusing on the ethical and legal implication of mobility data in terms of affecting the fundamental rights, broadly speaking, but more narrowly, the fundamental rights to data protection. And I cannot forget the many months of quarrels when we were all working, when a number of us was working on the development of the tracking apps. And the misplaced accent was on the fact that data protection was killing the right to health, that data protection was killing people, which is not at all the case. I mean, data protection, and the way it has been unfolding under European Union law, it's a tool to enable fundamental rights. I mean, we do want to track not people, but the spread of the virus without enabling discrimination of individuals. And this goes both with a reference to individuals, but also to businesses. And think about the fact that the news that Giovanni was found positive when he was at the supermarket down the corner. And the first reaction would be that people irrationally would not go anymore to the supermarket. I'm not there anymore. And since I've been spotted, probably the place has been cleaned up, sanitized, and further safeguards were taken, right? So it's counterintuitive. But the point here is that we need to focus on personal data protection to enable the use of the data. So that's why, I mean, the technologies you guys are exploiting are very, very, very important. But from the discussion emerged also another element that it's leading me to a provocation, to a very deep provocation. I mean, we're pretty much aware that anonymization is dead. I mean, technically speaking, it's only a matter of time, resources, and interest, as nicely put, by the way, by the GDPR in its referrals, before re-identifying individuals. So shouldn't we start from this assumption, trying to scale the technological and the legal tools accordingly? So the provocation. I mean, we do know, for instance, that telecommunication companies have a humongous amount of data, including mobility data. I mean, they're really the ones potentially tracking us down from one cell to another with our mobile phones. They do have all those data, right? But we have a law that says you cannot use those information for further uses. And so far, the rule has been working, at least to the best of our knowledge, right, Frederick? Now, the point is, and that's the provocation, should we start calling things with their real name? That is, maybe we do need some hard legislation, which is very narrowly crafted. We will need to re-identify under certain instances, but we should be sanctioned harshly and effectively non-permitted uses. And clearly, we cannot put, I mean, the rush, the technological rush to protect data, it's lost from the beginning if the value of the data raises up. I mean, nobody is interested to re-identify my personal information. I'm worth nothing. But if my, let's say, my genetic data starts to be suddenly very, very rewarding, because whoever owns me cut a piece of my skin can extract a cell line that can profit billions. I mean, be sure that there will be some criminal or more or less criminal individuals try to track me down, right? So first provocation is, should we leverage better way regulation, so having less regulation but more narrowly crafted in clear-cut bands? All right. A second part of the provocation, it's related to the ethical use of the data and the non-ethicity of not using the data. And that goes exactly to the claim of René in his closing remark. I'm fully convinced, and I'm trying to write in my scholarly work, that actually already the GDPR, and also with the additions, we can like it or not, with the proposed legislation like the Data Governance Act, it's clearly pointing towards broader, easier, still with safeguards, use for research purposes, for instance, for general interest purposes, the sharing of data, making a clear distinction whether we are sharing data for general interest, trying to prevent full surveillance, as René was pointing out, in a different setting than for commercial exploitation. So probably trying to clarify the technological and legal boundaries between general interest and non-general interest, which is not a public-private divide, as for instance, the sharing of data for developing vaccines is a clear example. And the GDPR, by the way, contrary to what happens in the California Privacy Act, the CCPA, doesn't make the distinction between private and publicly funded research for these purposes. So bottom line, I think mobility data are a very clear-cut example for illustrating how we need to, one, leverage the existing legislations, broadening the use and sharing for general interest of data, okay, which again, it's a public-private partnerships. Second, try to rethink the way we think to legislation in terms of leveraging outright bans, something that I must say, I'm afraid, doesn't work very well in the proposed AI regulation, in which we don't have the time. My presentation was going to lead there, but next awareness panels maybe, trying to show that basically the bans we have are pretty formal ones without substance. So we need to rework. And I stop because we are now 3 minutes over our timing. And sorry for being so scattered, but your thought-provoking interventions forced me.
Thank you, Giovanni. So in the end, we were not that bad in timing. So although, of course, we sacrificed questions to the last speakers. If there are questions now, I think we can find 5 minutes or something for questions to them. Yeah, I think, well, just a remark on Giovanni's, I think anonymization is not dead. There is a continuum between utility and privacy, and you can go to zero utility and super privacy, and that will always be a solution. The thing is to have good utility, and that's what worries us. As to the regulatory solution that Giovanni was proposing, I think that could have been a good solution maybe 20 years ago, but nowadays there are so many people in the data business that it is, and the different jurisdictions on top of that, that you need some technical countermeasure. You cannot rely on regulation alone, because those people are in different places and there are a lot of them.
That's for sure, Josep, but don't get me wrong. I didn't say that just no regulation, but understanding that will be always a rush to overcome. We do need law entering into there. Otherwise, I mean, there will be too much. Actually, the law is needed to give more weapons to the good guys in the technology. That's, I didn't want to separate them, just to actually have a stricter interplay and relationship. So the same technology used for good, it's different than used for bad. And I do not want to ban the technology as such. To the contrary, to enable it.
I wonder if there are any questions to Thierry or René. Regarding René's talk, I think that, in fact, I don't know what René's impression on the uptake of contact tracing apps is. Here in Europe, the uptake is rather poor, and this without René's concerns about Google and Apple. So people without that, people didn't feel very motivated to download and run those apps. We, together with some SoBigData people and others, we wrote a manifesto saying that there should be more incentives for people to download those and run those contact tracing apps by giving them statistics on or other features that could be more useful, because currently, as it currently stands, the only use of those contact tracing apps is to give you bad news in case you have been close to some positive. But by default, there is nothing, and it might be bad news. So with those incentives, it is very hard for people to follow.
Well, in Germany, there were no such incentives. The only incentive was the Corona Warn app, as it's called in Germany, is has a high standard of data protection and IT security. And we have 27 million Germans have downloaded the app. And everybody is sure this is not the perfect tool to fight the pandemic. And it's only a small puzzle tile. But people were not afraid of the app after Google and Apple said we won't let go with a centralized approach, as the federal government had the idea in the first round. And then Google and Apple said, no way, this will end up like in France, where Google and Apple forced the French government to drop their centralized approach. And in Germany, then we had a decentralized approach. People said this is not of that much use for fighting the pandemic, but the trust of the people was not a big issue after that anymore.
We had a workshop on exposure notification at NIST a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers had some app that gave people some benefit, immediate tangible benefit in using it. I forget, but if you send me email, I can send you the link of that work. I think it's Carnegie Mellon, maybe. And as a comment, I think I really like Giovanni's enunciation of the problem. That is, if we could somehow be able to tell that some application is being placed there for the public good and does not have extraneous interests associated with it, then I don't have many concerns about privacy in that setting. And that I am there, this is not the way it goes in the US. In fact, in the US, it is often the case that anything government is bad and it's against the freedom of the people and all that. So I'm speaking here not as a government person, as just a personal, on my personal opinion is that the public interest trumps many minor private concerns. And if we can somehow legislate so that we can first of all outlaw the surveillance capitalism, simply outlaw it, and I think that will be a help to both companies and populations, and I think it could be done. But also if one can codify, find a way to determine whether the public interest is being served, that would be very nice. But in the US, that's not likely. Mm-hmm. But Europe, maybe.
Yeah, because we don't have the big techs; they are American. So, yeah. Any other remarks on any of the speakers? I mean, Frederick, René, Thierry, and Giovanni.
Well, just a remark, maybe. The discussions were a lot around the pandemics, I guess, which is for me, we are at the combination between mobility data and health data. And actually, this is just the, let's say, the current state, which means that we have this combination, but very soon we will have a different combination of mobility data with, for instance, touristic data, or with, let's say, accessibility data for limited mobility people. So this is very interesting because for me, anonymization is at stake in this specific context when we try to combine really data from different sectors, because the risk of re-identification is the highest in this context. So that's a remark.
if I may, I mean, because you are really pulling by the jacket myself, because the reason I made those statements are basically in the example you gave. Okay, wait a moment. I do need to have some access to disability people data to serve them. So we have to find technical and legal solutions. They cannot be separated to enable a certain level of access because it's functional to serve those people and prevent what's the real problem, and that usually it's the function creep. And to be honest, the only way to prevent a function creep, unfortunately, is the rule of law. I say unfortunately because the risk, or even in democracies, to tip on a different turn has been, I mean, showed several times also within the European Union in the last few years. But that's the only way. But that's the point. Insisting in privacy, data protection is preventing. It's a dead hand, because we do need to have different levels of access. I mean, the same is for environmental reasons. I mean, the mobility data are needed to reduce carbon impact, to reduce threat to risk, to double check the quality of the air. And we can focus and save energy, save the planet. So I'm really, really strongly engaged in that idea. We need to have different layers to access and use. It can be done. But I stop, otherwise we can go. we need to have another awareness panel, Josep. Yeah. Let's put at work on that.
Not too short. Is there anyone in the audience who would make any remark? If not, I think I think we could go on for a while, but I think it's a matter of maybe resorting to emails in case.